So it's the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, known as Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat of return. It comes from the title of the Haftorah, Shuvah Yisrael, Return, O Israel, Ad Adonai Lehecha, unto God your Lord. Ki chashalta ba'avonecha, because you have stumbled on your sins. So it's obviously a time of contemplation in which we spend some time thinking about our behaviors, our choices, our decisions. And unfortunately now we live in a time where there's a layer on top of everything which complicates all our behaviors and all our actions. Obviously, it's not a surprise to anyone that there seems to be, and I say seems to be because I'm not an expert, I just hear what you hear, there's a second wave, so to speak. In other words, what's happened is the openness of the summer has led to communal transmission of COVID-19, and there's a lot of challenges, kids going back to school, a lot of young people are now infected, and so on. And I'm not a doom and gloom guy. I just believe that we should continue doing what we're doing, stay home unless necessary, go out safely. We have much more clarity on the rules right now. We know what is and is not a risk. We know basic behaviors. We know that masks are essential. We know. And let's keep doing what we know and hope everyone stays safe and well, follow guidance, and hopefully we don't have a mad rush to the intensive care units. Hospitals do not end up overflowing, and we beat this one again. With flu season coming on, it's obviously much worse because if you look at the trends during flu season, well, hospital emergency rooms are overwhelmed and ICUs and so on, and a lot of people, elderly and young, tend to be at highest risk from flu. And yes, everyone has to get a flu shot this year. Unless, of course, that's not your gig and that's your problem. But if you are willing to get a flu shot, get it as soon as possible. Hopefully it's the right formula this year. Hopefully it prevents a lot of flu. Hopefully by preventing a lot of flu, we prevent a lot of overwhelming visits to the emerge system. And if you have a flu, you won't know whether you're sick for one or the other. The best thing to do is try to prevent it as much as possible. So please get your flu shot. And Allegra, if you're watching, I'm sorry, the needle will only hurt for a split second. And the doctor will use a butterfly needle, which you'll hardly even feel, I promise. It's really important this year. So, in today's reading, we come across one of the most astonishing things that I've really seen in a while, which is Moses, at the end of his life, formulates some kind of dirge, poetry, some kind of liturgical recitation of his worldview, and it comes stumbling out of him, it seems. It's a collection of so many different ideas just rolling out of his mind, and if you start to unpack it slowly, you start to discover that he has compacted in a short few verses, 30 verses or so, of two-column writing to indicate that it is poetic. Short sentences, sort of like in Hemingway style. He's just put it all out there. And if you go through it, you come across some incredibly powerful ideas, and I urge you to take some time with it if you can. This would be Deuteronomy chapter 32, and see all the things he says, but let's look at a few. Now, I'm not sure whether Moses is talking about himself or God or future generations, but he talks about how destruction is the fault of the children, not his own, you warped and twisted generation. He's talking about next generations and who is responsible for their behavior. Can it all be laid at the feet of parents? Well, I remember Bernhard Schlink's famous line, children are no less self-righteous than their parents, only more cruel, which is a very powerful statement. It should be unpacked. Children no less self-righteous than their parents, only more cruel. Wow. So he's talking about the notion of responsibility. You can't lay it all at the feet of how you were raised. There are certain standards and certain behaviors, and societies make their own decisions. And you can't always blame everything on your ancestors. In other words, we have the ability to change our behavior regardless of our ancestors. Just look at what happened in the revolution, the hippie revolution in the 60s. Late 50s, it was enough for people. They were pushing out from under the yoke of essentially colonial government, and they wanted to get beyond the warmongering, beyond the structure of supposed civility, and they wanted freedom. And it resulted in one movement. Civil rights movement clearly pushed things very differently and is clearly not finished yet. But people seek freedom. And part of freedom is taking responsibility for your own actions. Part of freedom is recognizing the leadership of the past. And part of freedom is taking responsibility for the future that you create with that freedom. One of the greatest problems I have with things like the Green New Deal is that it takes no responsibility for the future, but it takes all the guilt of the past. And that's a big problem. When you want to make change, you can't just resolve the guilt of the past. You have to look at the responsibility of the future. While the intentions may be good, it's twisted to suggest that now you throw what you don't want for yourself, which is debt and pollution. You now throw new curves and new challenges and almost overwhelming challenges down the road, maybe 2, 3, 4 generations. Why should that be the case? Each generation has to take its own responsibility, looking both backwards and forwards. A very powerful idea that Moses compacts in one tiny little sentence. Of course, one of the most often quoted phrases, remember days long ago, ponder the years of each generation, ask your father and let him tell you, and your grandfather who will explain it. A very powerful statement used to remind people that our ancestors and our elderly have knowledge, they have experience, they know what's happened. It's hard for young people to learn from experience. They want to experience it themselves. Unfortunately, by not asking, by not engaging, by not learning from those who have gone past, we find ourselves struggling with not having enough time to have all the experiences and still benefit from the experiences. It's the phrase that is used, it's a shame that youth is wasted on the young. The idea that once you have all the experience, you don't have enough vigor to engage in life fully. So the challenge, of course, that Moses is suggesting is that you need to find out what happened in the past. But the corollary to that is you can't always listen to what happened in the past. People have a spin. People have their own views. People live in a certain time. You can't just take the past as a fact. You have to take the past as information. So while you're asking and engaging, you're doing more than just thinking that you just discovered the world, but at the same time, asking is critical with an eye to what does it mean to me, just like we talked about earlier, is taking responsibility for your own changes and your own freedom. There's some beautiful imagery about an eagle's nest, about cheese and wheat and the blood of grapes. It's a beautiful, beautiful imagery that Moses provokes in our thinking. But then there's a very interesting phrase, which is chapter 17. And Moses says, Yizbechu la'shedim lo Eloha, Elohim lo yida'um, chodashim ekarobo lo sa'arum avotechem. They sacrificed to demons who were non-gods, deities they never knew. These were new things recently arrived, which their ancestors never would consider. Wow. Demons, non-God demons. They were sacrificing to demons, deities that they never knew, brand new deities. Moses again continues with his great fear of a loss of faith in the one God, and legitimately so, because sometimes what's new is most attractive. But let's talk about sacrificing to demons. And this is where we start to tap into the story of Yom Kippur. During the high holidays, there are many different themes, many of them popular. People know about shofar. They might know about zichronot, memory. They might even know about kingship. They might even know the 3 themes of Musaf. They obviously know the theme of Yom Kippur, which is atonement. But do you know the theme of Yom Kippur called avodah? Avodah means the work or service or worship service, in which it's a replication of what happened in the temple during the high holidays of biblical times. And if you don't, it's probably because the Machzor gives it a few pages, and in our Machzor particularly, it shortens it down to some of the highlights. If you use a traditional or Orthodox Machzor, you'll see the entire conversation about what happened and what the service looked like in the temple. Obviously, that service was watched by Israelites, managed by Levites, and conducted by priests, with the person performing all the rituals and rites, the high priest. Now, what happened there were vestments, there were clothing, there were many changes of clothing from white to gold to back to white, and there was a screen put up in the temple courtyard, which held thousands and thousands of onlookers. And behind that screen, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would come in wearing his vestments and his clothing. He would undress behind the screen, dip himself into the mikveh, purify, come out, change his clothing. This happened over and over all day on Yom Kippur. There were sacrifices to be made. There was blood to be splattered. There were words. And of course, the denouement of Yom Kippur was when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies one day a year, achat bashana. Once a year, he was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies where the ark was, where the golden ark within which were contained the tablets that Moses inscribed, and of course, which is a whole other conversation, not for today, the shivrei luchot, the broken pieces of the luchot that Moses shattered when Israel was intransigent. So into this space, the Holy of Holies, goes the high priest with a fire pan of incense. So incense is combined of spices, and it has all kinds of fragrances and grasses, and it's smoking. And he walks in through the smoke, and the smoke fills the small chamber, and if he's worthy, he recites his prayer and he leaves. But not every high priest was worthy, and if you were not worthy, according to legend, you died on the spot. I can't verify any of these facts. I can only go based on the writings of our ancestors, Josephus and so on, and the rabbis of the Talmud. But I assume they're telling you the way it was, because many of them were there. And there was a time when the high priest was a political appointment. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and sure enough, the high priest was often an appointee. It was a great job, except for one time a year when you had to go into the Holy of Holies, and that's when everybody knew whether you were legit or not. And if you were not, it was over. Some people were willing to risk it. Some people believed they were legit. Some people believed they were pious, but they clearly weren't. Well, they started attaching a rope around the waist of the high priest so that if they died, they could pull him out. Not an easy feat, not an easy story, but imagine going into to the priest and saying, we're tying a rope around you because in case you're not worthy, we're pulling you out. And that's what happened. So once a year, the high priest would go in, fill the room with the smoke of the incense, and ask for forgiveness for the people and leave. And if the Kohen Gadol, if the high priest was successful, there's a text that we have in our Yom Kippur liturgy in the Avodah that says, V'yom tov haya oseh Kohen Gadol. And when the Kohen Gadol, when the big kahuna would come out of the temple in good health, having survived his encounter in front of the ark, B'tzeito mebeit kodshei HaKadoshim, when he came out of the Holy of Holies, he would make a festival. And there's a long, beautiful prayer that the Kohen Gadol would recite for the health of people, for the wealth of people, for success, for a year of agricultural success, for rain, for sun, for everything. And the last bit of the prayer is so fascinating. It says, and the last thing is that the people of the Sharon region not experience earthquakes and their houses remain intact. Because that was a region of the land that was prone to earthquakes. I don't know the exact topography. There are active volcanoes. There's moderately active volcanoes in the Middle East and some in Israel. Maybe they were experiencing earthquakes at the time. Maybe their houses were falling down. But he goes from the high and mighty of thanking God for the grand privilege of being able to appear in the Holy of Holies, and he ends with the most micro, that the people of Sharon should be safe. It's such a beautiful prayer. Now, during the Avodah service, a lot of other interesting things happened, including one that gets us back to sacrificing to demons. There were 2 goats. This is not Chad Gadya. This is not the goat that the father bought for 2 zuzim. There were 2 goats. Sa'ir achad lichatat, 1 goat to sacrifice, in a normal ritual of sacrifice, kill, blood, splatter, say confession at the altar. The second one was for Azazel. It's not clear what Azazel is. And how did they know which goat they were? Which goat went to where? There were 2 little plaques with a chain on them. They were put in a box, and the high priest blindly stuck his hand in, pulled out one of them that said Ladonai or La'azazel, and put it on the head of the goat. And that's how they knew which goat was going where. Even the goats didn't know their fate. Well, the goat that was for chatat, that was for sacrifice, for atonement, goodbye, do your job. The goat that was for Azazel was much more complicated. It had to leave the temple by the bridge. You know, you've been to Robinson's Arch. Robinson's Arch has collapsed. That's why there are big stones down at the bottom. But that archway used to lead from the Temple Mount out to the valley. And it would take you across the valley of the city of David so that you didn't have to go down into the valley. It's just like the bridge over the Don Valley Viaduct. Instead of having to go into the valley of the Don River and come up Pottery Road in the old days, what did you used to do? They built a viaduct. Now you can go straight across. It saved you hours and hours of schlepping. So they had that. And that, once you went there, you started heading out into the Judean desert. And this goat had to go out into the Judean desert. But first, they confessed all the sins on the head of this goat. And then it left. And it went with Ish Iti, somebody who was organized, and they passed it on to other people till eventually it made it to a place in the desert where what did they do? They pushed it over a cliff onto jagged rocks so it could be shredded and die, and that blood sacrifice was atonement, at least in their mind, for the sins of the people. So the goat was shredded into its mortal bits, and the people got to live their lives for another year. Atonement was completed because all their sins were now scattered and paid for. This is where we get the ritual of kaparot, where we don't. But there are those who take live chickens and they hold it over their head, a male for male, a female for female. They hold it by the legs and they say, this is my atonement, this is my forgiveness. They confess their sins, and then the animal is given to the shochet and slaughtered. I once went early in the morning with a friend of mine when I was a kid, probably in grade 5 or 6, to see that happen in Kensington Market in the old Pearls down there. I still remember it vividly. It was quite the shocking, eye-opening experience. In our family, the tradition was to do it with money, where you take money and you say, this is, instead of my death, I'm giving charity. Well, there is something a little bit about that, which because you are actually performing an act of charity, of kindness, hoping in return you have a good, meaningful life. There is a bit of a strange trade-off there where you're bargaining with divinity. I'm not quite sure that works, but that's what it was. Having said that, I remember also that on our family porch one time, we were the beneficiary of one of those slaughtered chickens, or a bunch of those slaughtered chickens that came from Kaparot, because the tradition is to give it to poor families. And my mother was beside herself, and I don't blame her. Nobody wants to feel poor just because you have 9 kids and you're both on teacher salaries. They led a very wonderful and dignified life, and we never felt rich. We didn't feel like we had luxury, but we didn't feel like we lacked for anything. And poverty is a different expression of financial capability. And I don't know what happened to the chicken in the end. I just remember that scene where the chicken was on the porch and my mother didn't even want to touch it. It sort of made her feel something that she refused to feel. That stuck with me for a very long time. How the act, and hear this is really important, how the act of charity can also be demeaning. Not every charitable act raises up the recipient. It might raise the giver, where they feel they're doing charity, but the recipient may actually be demeaned. And that is why I prefer charity to be a form of just behavior or justice as opposed to grandeur. Because one person should not profit either financially or in their feelings at the expense of another. So back to Azazel. If you want to curse somebody, what do you say to them? In Hebrew, it's a great, awful curse. You say, Lech Lazazel, which is another way of saying go to hell, which means go jump off a cliff and shred yourself somewhere. Totally negate another human being. Here, there's a huge debate about what they were sacrificing that animal to. Were they sacrificing it to the desert? Because if you look at the text of Moses again in Haazinu, he talks about the howling tempest of a desert in which Israel comes from. And in the desert was something called the Seir. The Seir was the satyr, was a devil-like divinity that had to have its bloodlust satisfied with a sacrifice. And is it possible that in the Israelite conscience, there still was a need to sacrifice to this, devil-like figure that lived in the desert? It's possible, because there is no doubt that many pagan rituals were subsumed in other religions, including Judaism. So early Israelite feelings might have been to sacrifice to the Seir. And there is other text in which it is forbidden to sacrifice to the desert devil, so to speak, which seems to have been a half goat, half human, in their imagination at least. And if you look at the text of what they were supposed to do with the Azazel, it says, Aaron, the high priest, shall press both his hands on the live goat's head, and he shall confess on it all the Israelite sins, rebellious acts, and inadvertent misdeeds. When he has placed them on the goat's head, he shall send it to the desert with a specially prepared man. The goat will carry all the sins away to a desolate area when it is sent to the desert. And that's all it says. It doesn't say that you throw it off a cliff. It just says you send it off in the desert. Now, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that you take one goat and you sacrifice it. I'm not a big sacrificer, but I understand the ritual. And I understand the ritual symbolically of suggesting that sometimes the human being expresses their disconnection and loss through exile or through wasteland or having to start over again or finding new places and so on, taking risks. That is a symbolism I can get under. But I can't really get under the devil sacrifice and so on. But it's not clear because eventually the practice went from sending it out into the desert to sending it to its death. So it's just a really interesting conversation about what happens in the desert. And also, it's reminiscent of the story of Ishmael being sent out into the desert to die by Abraham at the behest of Sarah. So all these things come together and connect on the high holidays as we bring these texts together, where you start to see about the rituals, about Moses' conversation about devil sacrifice, and how, in fact, it seems that it's possible that the Israelites returned to that form of pagan devil worship, and which was fairly common in those days. Now, I'm sure there are many different views on this, and it's fine. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's just a conversation about what could this have meant that they reverted to the shredding death sacrifice for the second goat. Finally, I want to just pick up on the tone and phrasing of the Haftorah today. In the phrasing of the second part of the Haftorah, where we read from the book of Joel, it talks about initially from the book of Hosea, repent, O Israel, return to God, and so on. And then we append the second bit where you saw those two columns. It starts off like this: blow a shofar, make the day sacred, call for a pause, gather the people, sanctify the people, gather the elderly, gather the children, gather breastfeeding babies. Now here, listen carefully to this part. The groom should leave his chamber. The bride should abandon her chuppah, her canopy. Between the hallway leading to the temple and the altar, the priests should weep, and they should say, "Have compassion on your people." Do you hear that tone? Gather the people, abandon your actions, do something different, and may the priests weep in the temple. Now listen to this poem. It's called Funeral Blues by W.H. Auden. Just listen to the tone. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the piano and muffled drum, bring out the coffin and let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, "He is dead." Put crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. And of course, probably you've heard this before. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week, my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. And again, picking up the concept and the feel of Joel. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. And when I'm reading this reading of Joel, I feel that poem in his writing. And I can't tell you why Auden, what his source was, but when I read this portion of Joel, I feel that Joel could have continued in the same vein in which he says, stop all the clocks. And that's exactly what he says. He says, Tiku shofar, blow the shofar in Zion, start fasting, stop eating, kiru atzara, stop everything. It's just such a powerful phrase, and that is an ancient bit of writing and a modern bit of writing, and you see how they directly coincide. I hope that your Yom Kippur is both modern and ancient, and that you find a way to make them coincide. We intend here, beginning just before 6 p.m., to provide a Kol Nidre service and a High Holiday Yom Kippur service, followed by a Ne'ilah service that hopefully does that for you and makes the modern relevant and the relevant feel like it's part of the tradition. Shabbat Shalom. We'll be back in a few minutes with conclusion of services.